Step into the danger zone. You don't stop listening. It's Let's Find Out with Diego. Step into it. Ooh, yeah!
Are you curious about the unknown, the unexplainable? Do you find yourself intrigued by the mysterious and paranormal side of our world? Join us on an adventure into the world of inexplicable discoveries and investigations that may someday give us the final answer as to what may be behind the veil of reality. The borders of space and time have opened once again, and transmitting from the mountains of West Virginia, it's time once again for Let's Find Out with Diego. The universe is waiting for you.
The borders of space and time have opened once again, and transmitting from the mountains of West Virginia. It's another episode of Let's Find Out with Diego. Thank you for taking this journey with me. On this episode of Let's Find Out, delving into the depths of witness reports and skeptics' theories, our guest confronts conventional beliefs and urges humanity to push beyond the limits of our current knowledge. He is an accomplished author, independent journalist, talk radio host, and former U.S. Senate staff member. His book not only sheds light on the reality of the UFO phenomenon, but also challenges us to consider new possibilities and expand our understanding of the world around us. All this plus more. Please welcome to Let's Find Out, author of the book, The UFO Paradox, the celestial and symbolic world of unidentified aerial phenomena, Keith Thompson. Keith, my friend, welcome to Let's Find Out. I've been looking forward to having you on for a while now.
Thank you, Diego. I'm looking forward to our conversation. It's a great way to spend an hour or so. Let's get with it. Let's get at it.
Absolutely. You know, it's a beautiful sunny day here in West Virginia. It rained like a monsoon for about a week here, but we're back in action and ready to delve into a topic that for some would seem controversial because there's a lot of different types of beliefs out there where we have people who are the true believers and we have people that are hardcore skeptics, which is something that we'll cross over into here in a few minutes, my friend. But first, I like to start like this because as I'm reading the bio, and we're going back a few years, we're going to take the time machine and go back to sixth grade. It is actually around the time where I was also interested in the subject of UFOs. Now, yours was a little more brave than mine, where I just wrote down when I did my report to the teacher, but I did mine something different. It was on Alexander the Great, but there, you know, later in life, I realized there is a UFO connection to the whole Alexander the Great as well. But going back to sixth grade, my friend, what was it at such a young age that got you interested in the subject of UFOlogy?
Well, that's the key. It was a class assignment, so I didn't really come at it on my own, although I did, because there was a class assignment. It was my turn to give a current events report, an oral, stand up in front of the class, bring the news clippings related to whatever story you were paying attention to, and tell the class about it. It was kind of like be a newsman or a newswoman, be a journalist, report your findings on a story. And I did not have a background with the UFO phenomenon. I was not a science fiction reader. I was an inveterate reader, and I loved fiction and fantasy sometimes, but I was not particularly a sci-fi guy. So I didn't come at this through Star Trek or anything. If anything, I was more a fan of the Twilight Zone, that 1950s show. If there are any viewers who've never seen it, because it's long out of date, you can find black and white episodes of Rod Serling, the host, dealing with the mysterious realms that interact with us in our ordinary reality. So with that in mind, it was my turn. It happened, I was living in Northwest Ohio, where I grew up, and just north of Ohio, Michigan, near Ann Arbor, Michigan, there was a very controversial 3 or 4 day UFO sighting. Possibly it lasted over a week. That happens sometimes. They're called UFO flaps, F-L-A-P-S, flap of UFOs. And there were lights and apparent craft, and really I would soon find out that it was really kind of a central casting couldn't have sent a better UFO sighting. And in particular, this story, this Michigan story got the lead on the CBS Evening News with the late, great Walter Cronkite, anchorman. For several nights in a row, he would say, "Good evening, this is the CBS Evening News with Walter Cronkite. That amazing UFO sighting continues to stir controversy in Michigan. We're going to go there right away." And I was just glued to the set, man. I thought, this is what life's about. What's going on? Weird things happening in the sky. And again, I had no orientation to the subject, but I was naturally curious. So what made this story interesting to me was that an Air Force investigator, a consultant named J. Allen Hynek, Hynek, he came to be a legendary figure in UFO studies. He started as an astronomer. The Air Force brought him in to be a consultant to help resolve these cases, explain them. So he flew in to go to the witnesses, go to the hot spots, see what people reported, and listen and try to get a sense of the candor of people, the credibility of the reports. Did it look like a hoax? But that wasn't really going on here. That was not a common element here. Sometimes there are hoaxes. People try to pull off a fast one. In any case, he stepped up to a news conference. I reported to my class. He stepped up to a hastily assembled news conference with reporters from all around the country. And he said, "Well, let me begin by saying I can't, there are a lot of different sightings in this region last week, so I'm not going to try to cover it all, but I can say at the start that the sighting off to the side of town near the swampland could have been, might have been, maybe," he put it very conditionally. He said, "could have been, might have been swamp gas." Now, swamp gas, before I go further, swamp gas is a natural phenomenon. Gases near a swamp, they're outgassing of various kinds of gases that can sometimes ignite and cause lights. So if you've been to a swamp, you maybe have seen these luminous displays of light, but it was nothing like the full display. And he didn't say that the entire Michigan set of multi-day sighting was swamp gas, but that's what the reporters heard. And as soon as he let the phrase swamp gas out of his mouth, he was mortified to watch the reporters jump out of their seats, go out into the hallways to the payphones, as people did in those days. They didn't have a phone in their pocket, call their news bureaus and tell their bosses, "Hynek explains it all as swamp gas," which he didn't. So I told this to my class. To me, that was part of what made it a great story. Came time for questions and answers from my fellow students. One of them said, "Well, do you think this was from outer space? Are these aliens?" And I said, "Well, I don't think that myself at this point. I don't know for sure. That's one viewpoint," I said. And then someone else said, "Well, okay, if it wasn't that, and if it wasn't swamp gas, then what do you think it was?" I said, "Well, once again, I don't know from where I stand here." And, Diego, that was not me punting the ball. That wasn't an attempt to dodge the question. I honestly didn't know. I could have conjectured, but that isn't what that didn't feel like it was above my pay grade as a sixth grade student. I just simply described. I did say this, though. I said, what they described doesn't sound like swamp gas. And I added that the Air Force consultant didn't say they were all swamp gas either. I remember at that point, my teacher, Mrs. Lowry, came up and stood next to me, as she often did with the students giving the report. She stood next to me and looked out at the audience, 20 or so students, and said, "I think what Keith is telling us with something like this is that it's important to keep an open mind and ask relevant questions." Then she turned to me, and as teachers sometimes do, spoke to me by my entire name. She said, "Mr. Thompson, that was a fine report. You have the makings of a journalist, or maybe a scientist. Who knows, maybe even a detective." And then she said with a certain enthusiasm, "Follow the evidence wherever it leads." And the next thing, I was out on the playground with my fellow students. It was recess, and I got to be a normal 12-year-old again. But I tell that story right at the beginning of the book because that little bit of enthusiasm she offered, that affirmation, follow the evidence wherever it leads, keep an open mind, ask good questions, but follow the clues and put aside your beliefs about whether the clues make any sense. If that's what people report, stick with the reports. Don't believe the reports, but don't disbelieve them either. Put them over here, put them over there, and notice this is what people say, and it's what they don't say. So with that in mind, I have to tell you, that was like a benediction for me, almost like a blessing, because to have a teacher, I was a young, aspiring adult, 12 years old, but I had hopes of, I wanted I didn't know what I wanted to do, but I already was drawn to journalism. That's why I was watching Walter Cronkite cover this story. And sure enough, I became a journalist. I didn't become a scientist or a detective, although I think she was right. All three of those, journalist, detective, and scientist, are about, at least officially, following the evidence, putting aside your biases, or if you're going to bring your bias in, admit this is a bias. That's called being objective toward bias. So I didn't at that day think that I became a UFO investigator per se, but looking back, I never stopped paying attention. And I went on to follow these reports. I began to read the books in the field. And I found that, strangely, and then I'll open it up to whatever you want to ask next, I found that the more I learned, the more information I got, the more ignorant I became. And what I mean by ignorant, I want to be real clear. The more I knew, the more I learned, the less I knew, the less I understood. Because each time when you learn a new piece of information, a new distinction about a subject, you're very likely going to end up with 5 or 10 new questions that deal with that. So in a sense, you learn something new, then you realize how much you still don't know. And I never shied away from that. I don't have a problem with the phrase, I don't know, but I'm interested in finding out. To me, those go together very well. And that's the approach I took in this book. I'll say one more thing. When I wrote this book, I wanted to, now that the UFO phenomenon is more on the mainstream news stories than ever before, and news programs and so forth, I imagine that maybe a new generation of readers are going to come into the bookstore, or they're going to look at Amazon or Barnes and Noble online, and they're going to say, okay, I'm finally ready to take a look at this subject. Seemed to have a lot of woo-woo or outrageous thinking or a lot of speculation. But I've heard this writer takes a pretty down-to-earth journalistic approach. So I wanted to write a book for that reader, somebody who matched my own. I wanted to write the kind of book that I wanted to read, that I would want to read if I were coming at this as a beginner. So I really emphasized, that's why I began the book with my own story as a 12-year-old. I wanted to put the reader right there. Like, reader, maybe you're there with me. You're interested in us. You're interested in this. You have questions, and you don't want to be asked to take anything on faith. You want to see what the evidence really shows.
And that's a beautiful answer, because and that's the very definition of an amazing teacher, where some could have said, hey, what you're writing is nonsense, really go sit down. This one actually inspired you to, which kind of led you to a beautiful road down the way. But let me ultimate question about that report though. Do you recall the grade you got?
Do I recall what?
The grade you got.
Oh, I don't know if it was so much of a grade, but I can tell you from the answer, the response, fine report, Mr. Thompson. You have the makings of a journalist. I don't remember she had said anything quite like that to any of the other students. In general, she would say, good work, thank you. But I had a sense from her response that I had done well, and I felt that I had done well. But you're right, she didn't say to me anything like, well, Mr. Thompson, just between the two of us, or between all of us here, you don't believe in this nonsense, do you? She didn't ask me that. First of all, I didn't take a stand. I didn't talk about my own beliefs. I like to think, if I hadn't been shamed by that question, if the question had been sincere, rather than attempt to put me down, if the teacher had said with a smile and a friendly way, well, Keith, do you really believe this? I'd like to think I said, I don't know what to believe, but the evidence is really cool. That's probably what I would have said. I would have said, this is cool. I wouldn't have said compelling, because 12-year-olds don't use words like compelling or fascinating,
no,
provocative, but I would have said, I think it's really cool. It's a controversy. There's a difference of opinion about something. I already knew that's what drove good journalism. A story has point, counterpoint, experts, differing opinions, and a good article will often end with, presenting multiple viewpoints, especially if it doesn't resolve into a simple answer.
And that's one of those things with journalism. I say this because sometimes in our times, it seems that journalism has taken a turn, I would say, for the worse in a way, because there are those, and I'm sure there are honest ones out there. I'm not going to say kind of same thing with politicians. There's true believers that want to do the work, and there's ones that are kind of, you may not be able to trust what comes out, what they write or comes out of their mouth. Fast forwarding to when you went into journalism, can you recall during that time when you did your first article or wrote about anything UFO related? Was it one of those, did you think like, do I take this chance, or did you just go for it?
Well, let me answer that. I've written the news sources you mentioned. I've had a few pieces in the New York Times, Esquire magazine, San Francisco Chronicle, and other newspapers. I wrote for an independent weekly in Northern California for quite some time, and most of the stories I covered were, education, inventions, new entrepreneurs starting a new business, somebody with a new theory, criminal justice, homeschooling. I wrote an article about the homeschooling phenomenon at one point. Funny, I got a question on a recent podcast when I was out talking about my new book. And the interviewer was very, very sincere, warm question. He said, "Can you remember when you decided to move from being an investigative journalist to covering the kind of stories you had covered to becoming a UFO researcher?" And I thought, well, when did I shift from being an investigative journalist? I said, I didn't. No, I consider this to be the same approach I've always taken as an investigative journalist. It's just a subject matter that is a little further out. But you're right. It's not easy to get published on this subject. So I didn't write articles per se about UFOs, but I did publish a few in magazines eventually when I began to chime in on it. And so, but I've always been aware of what's called the ridicule factor. The laughter curtain gets dropped. I know when I was working on this book, and when somebody I would meet a new person, what do you do? I'd say, well, I'm a writer, and I knew where this is going to go. They'd say, oh, what do you write about? I mean, this time I'm at the dog park with my dog, right? And I'm really not there to talk about my work. I'm just there to be with fellow dog people. And I would remember sort of thinking, do I want to answer the question? Do I want to say UFOs? Because at minimum, I might have to listen to 20 minutes of somebody's opinion who tells me stuff I either already know or I recognize as speculative or as opinion, or people get excited about this subject. They often get very plugged in. So I found as I was writing the book, it would just save me time and trouble to not necessarily go into what I do and what I'm working on. Because of aware that unlike any other subject, if I were currently working on an article about how to improve your marathon time, how to run a faster marathon, I would likely that somebody would say, oh, that's interesting. Have you run one yourself? My cousin ran one. And that's probably where it would end. But with UFOs, or heaven forbid, psychic phenomena, you're going to get everybody chiming in about whether that's possible and so forth.
It's funny because as you're talking about, when people ask you, what do you write about? So it's the same thing people find out about that I'm a podcaster at work. Different jobs I've had, but now I've been here in my job for a long time. And it's one of those places to where a lot of people don't like to talk because they're not only feel ridicule, but fear of losing their job or something like that. So, but you'd be surprised, maybe not you, but some people would be surprised that I'm going to say in the high 90 percentiles, somebody always has some sort of story. If it's not theirs, it's their mom or grandmother, whether it's paranormal, UFO related, or cryptid related. And in a way, you kind of bond with that person because it's kind of like they feel comfortable talking to you about the subject now.
Well, I want to, and that's a very good point. I want to emphasize that the times when I have shared that I'm writing about the paranormal, and I do write about the paranormal dimensions of this phenomenon. I'm one of those researchers who, because I was told, or I should say, encouraged by my 6th grade teacher, follow the evidence wherever it leads. I mean, that could be a title of a book itself about an approach to life. Follow evidence, question your assumptions, look further than the surface, no matter what the topic. Of course, you can get in trouble that way. Socrates was punished with a death sentence in ancient Athens because he was, quote, corrupting the youth. Why was he corrupting the youth? Well, he was saying, question everything, question the received wisdom, question Greek mythology. Well, that wasn't very popular idea in ancient Greece, and he paid the ultimate price. So I want to emphasize, yes, I've talked with people about what I do, and I will get people who, if they trust me, they say, well, let me tell you what I saw one night while I was driving home. Or let me tell you about my grandparents, what they saw, and they never got over. And I mean a UFO sighting or a haunting in a house. And when I say that's what they experienced, okay, I'm not saying about the objective reality, although I think objectively there is a reality to the, well, in fact, I know that there is. The evidence is very strong that paranormal phenomena do happen. They don't currently fit the maps of Western science, but a lot of phenomena that we now understand is true didn't always fit the maps of science. When Columbus and Magellan and the other Spanish travelers, explorers came to the New World, they came with maps, were written on the edge of the map. Out to the left-hand corner would be an arrow that says, there be the sea serpents. They had maps that referred to where the sea serpents were. That was their way of saying, don't go there. No one's been there. Turns out there weren't sea serpents, but that was the category. So even Western science today has its own categories called sea serpents, which don't really exist because we haven't approved. I often say the UFO phenomenon and psychic phenomena and the near-death phenomenon and all of these related mysteries, I guess they didn't get the memo that went out saying you're not real. They didn't get the memo that told them not to be themselves, if you will. So UFOs are real. It's just that our maps haven't explained what they are and where they're from and all of those wonderful questions that my book is about.
And that's what we're here to find out, my friend. With a lot of these sightings of UFOs, UAPs, USOs, whatever you want to call them. So let's look at it like this. There's been an increase in sightings in the last several years of UFOs. And I'll share this with you because I was reading a few articles before I came on with you and a couple of weeks ago, because I subscribe to a lot of newsletters and they come in and there's always weekly reports of such, whether it's UFOs, Bigfoot. I think there was just a recent sighting of a Loch Ness type somewhere. Lately, not only in the United States, but Austria, Prague, Brazil, Finland, and recently, I think either in July of this year or last year, and I apologize for not writing down the date, but there was one in Miami. I think a few months ago there was something going on in Miami as well that was, I think it might have been not UFO related, but I'll leave that to the listeners to figure out on their own. What in your opinion, what's causing the rise of people witnessing these things happening? What is shifting in Earth right now that this activity keeps growing by the year?
Well, there may be multiple factors. The debunkers would say, and when I say what a debunker is, let me specify the difference between a genuine skeptic and a debunker. I'm a skeptic myself. I mean, I think skepticism should be part of this. It's not a separate category. We should always question our assumptions. If a witness says they saw something, you ask skeptical questions, not attempting to cast doubt, but trying to draw out the information. Did anyone else see it? Was there any other evidence to the side, and so forth? But that's different from what I call the debunker. The debunker is somebody who often arrives claiming the mantle of science, big science, or as I sometimes playfully call it, BS. I'm a big believer in science, don't get me wrong. The scientific method is our way of separating what can be confirmed with what can be falsified. I don't want to take anything. If I can get an explanation for something that's conventional, I'd rather have that. But I don't want the idea that it must be conventional. Certainly, it has to be conventional because there's no such thing. I mean, this is really what you hear from the debunkers. So, with that in mind, the debunkers would tend to say, well, the more people report this stuff, there's a contagious phenomenon that happens, and people report it to get in on the action. There's no evidence that anything like that happens. Think about it. is there anything to gain from being associated in general with the UFO phenomenon? I mean, do you really want to be associated with it? But at the same time, more people who have seen these TV shows like Unsolved Mysteries that take, I believe, largely responsible, witness-based, evidence-based approaches to these subjects. Thank goodness for Netflix and for Amazon Prime and more coverage of solid investigation. So I think more people are increasingly coming out of the closet. And then, frankly, I think a side angle of this is you're no doubt aware that just in popular culture right now, more people are practicing meditation, practicing prayer, practicing contemplation. They often define themselves as being more spiritual than religious. Doesn't mean that they hate religion, but spirituality, the quest to find answers about deep meaning and purpose and value, is leading more and more people to experiential approaches like meditation. And I think when people begin to explore their own psyche, their own sensations, noticing the mind, I'm a big believer that meditation is a practice. It doesn't have to be religiously based, and meditation doesn't have to be at odds with anything you believe in a religious realm. I mention meditation because I think more people have experimented with meditation. Some have experimented intelligently with psychedelics. By that, I don't mean irresponsible drug use of various kinds, but I mean psychedelic investigation. And they have come to realize that there are subtle realms around us. There are subtle energies. We still don't know how acupuncture works, but we know that it works. There are controlled studies that show that somehow the body's energy, what we call an energy system, even though we don't fully understand that the body has energy system, somehow these acupuncture needles penetrate and stimulate the healing response. So look, there are a whole lot of areas we don't know much about. But to answer your question, I think more people feel less stigma than ever. I will quickly remind you, you may remember from Close Encounters of the Third Kind, which I think is in many ways still the best movie of all time, 1977, I think. Maybe
Yes.
it was 78, and just around there. There's an opening scene where there's an air traffic control tower, and they've got three different airlines on the horn, Pan Am, TWA, and United. And each one of the pilots in the area is reporting some kind of strange aerial something, an unidentified flying object, but they're not calling it that. But they're calling to the tower and say, hey, tower, what's this over here at 45 degrees or northwest, southeast, whatever? And the tower says, we don't know. Well, we see it too. We see it on radar. And then they go back and forth. And then the air traffic controller says, one by one, to each of the pilots, United 642, do you wish to report a UFO? And there's a pause, and the pilot says, negative. And he asks the other two pilots, and the response comes back with those as well. Negative. And one of them says, I wouldn't know what to report anyway. And the air traffic controller says, understood. Understood. Thank you. So the point is, that's probably changed now. But at that time, an airline pilot reports a UFO, and then the news media gets wind of it, and they find out that pilot's name, go to their home, land on their front porch, and beleaguer them with questions about, do you believe in little green men from outer space? That's not a good career move, not good to raise a family. So the stigma has been big, but the stigma is lifting, not surprisingly, because as you know, in 2017, the New York Times came out with a story, front page, that contrary to the idea that UFOs are nothing to pay attention to, there's nothing going on, and decades of ridiculing witnesses, the Pentagon has been studying this phenomenon, calling them unidentified aerial phenomena, or UAPs instead. That's the whole story there. The acronym upgrade from UFO to UAP. But in any case, I think people are more willing to come forward. Now, is there also an increase in size? Is there a greater number? I can't say for sure about that. But I do know there's a greater number of reports based on less stigma.
Yes, and I think also with the invention of internet and these cell phones now, where maybe I would have said increased sightings or reports, but maybe it's easier now to get this information than it was when we were growing up. Because when we were growing up, in order for us to find an article or any reports on UFOs, we had to go to the library, either use the microfiche and know what you're looking for, or tilt your head sideways, look at every single book and see if there's something in there for you to read. Now, going back to the whole concept of there's healthy skeptics, and we're talking about people who are just skeptics because, in my opinion, it's because maybe they're uncomfortable with the subject, or are they part of a group of people that claim they're skeptics just to throw you off the trail somehow?
Well, let me go back to some of the big cases in history, not involving UFOs, but the famous Italian astronomer, Galileo, with his computations that he worked out at his table in his room, and a device which he either invented or got access to, I don't know the full story, called a telescope. He put those two together and concluded, well, looky here. The Earth orbits the sun, not the other way around. And he was, in other words, confirming what Copernicus had said. And as he began to spread word on this, that was pretty big news. And he got a knock on the door from the religious authorities who were in charge of pronouncing on questions of fact, because science was still very young. We had not yet differentiated an approach to knowledge that was not only faith-based. So the people who were in charge of enforcing religious faith also were in charge by their own appointment, self-appointment, to be in charge of fact on other areas. So Galileo was simply, so anyway, here was Galileo's famous response was, well, look, you don't have to take my word for anything. By the way, you guys, I'm a religious man myself. I'm a devout Catholic. What I'm doing doesn't question my faith. And the church says, well, it questions our faith. It questions the faith. And he said, well, look, don't take my word for it. Look at my computations over at my desk, and then look through my telescope. And famously, they refused to look through the telescope. They refused to avail themselves of the very method that would be able to either confirm or falsify. Maybe Galileo was looking, he had the numbers backwards, and was looking and using the telescope mistakenly. And that good science corrects itself. The point is, they wouldn't even use the methodology. And the analogy there is many of these debunkers, you know when you're in the presence of a debunker rather than a skeptic. You see these TV shows or a podcast. I'm not going to go naming names, but there's an astronomer who often chimes in on the UFO phenomenon. He's currently an actor, and he's one of these TV scientists. He does have a PhD in astrophysics and so forth. I've heard him on podcasts, and he will often begin with a comment that he doesn't understand how much it calls his credibility into question. He'll say to the podcast host, you know, I will be honest with you, I don't pay much attention to these sighting reports. I don't delve into them very deeply. Well, that's an interesting thing right off the top, to establish your credibility and your authority by saying you don't delve very deeply. And then what they say next is almost mind-boggling. They say, but I've looked enough. I've looked deeply enough to know that these reports are often wishful thinking, misidentified airplanes. They don't know the difference between a flying saucer and Mars. Well, that's just a lot of a mess. That's a big mess of stuff right there. You admit that you don't know. First of all, you assume that people are not able to make those distinctions. Sure, people misidentify things all the time. That's true. And there are hoaxes and there are hallucinations, and so forth. But to admit at the start, you're credible. Why is this person even invited on the program if they will say that they don't pay attention to the reports? They don't delve very deep. It would be like me saying to that astronomer, I actually have this fantasy. Someday maybe I'll be on a podcast with one of these debunkers. And when he says that, I'll say, well, listen, you're an astrophysicist, right? He'll say, yes, sir. I said, I'd like to come to the next astrophysics conference, and I'd like to present one of the lead papers. And he'd go, great, what's your credential? Well, the truth is I don't pay much attention to what astrophysics is really about. I haven't delved into it very deeply, but I've got some off-the-hand opinions. He'd say, well, then you're not qualified to. You don't have the training or the expertise. And then I would say, I just set you up, pal. That's what you also don't have. You don't have training or expertise to look at this phenomenon. No, don't get me wrong. I don't have training in UFO research, but I'm a seasoned observer, and I believe things now, or I once believed things that I no longer believe. I use a scientific approach, sir. But when you admit off the top that you don't even pay attention to the phenomenon, but you know for sure what it's really about, that calls your credibility. Why would you ever acknowledge such a thing? Sometimes they're not even good debunkers. So I don't think in most cases they have an ideological agenda. The belief that the materialist science doesn't understand consciousness. We really have not delved deeply into the nature of consciousness, the nature of mind, and the paranormal dimensions of this phenomenon are such that it calls into question whether we really understand time and space. Well, if you're a physicist, astrophysicist, you think you do to understand time and space. But there are phenomena that behave in ways that don't go with time and space as we understand them. So maybe there are more dimensions than 3 of space and 1 of time. In string theory, a particularly arcane division of physics, there's a belief that there's either 11 or 26 dimensions. Well, if there's that many dimensions, maybe there are phenomena that are coming in and out of these dimensions, like the Twilight Zone. So again, I don't have the ultimate answers, but I do know that the phenomenon requires new kinds of thinking.
It does. And it's kind of, well, not kind of, it is interesting how we're almost turned a little bit on not in belief systems, where in the past, the days of talking about Galileo, Copernicus, where the church at the time was a hard stance no, and then people who went outside of that suffered grave consequences, to sort of say it in a way, when science was just starting to get its feet wet and actually start making sense out of the universe or several things. Fast forward now to common day, as we are now, science seems to be the new religious, where they're not going to accept anything other than what they say. And I've noticed, and I'm not trying to upset anybody when I say this, but I've noticed now where the church itself, or I can only speak from the Christian side, I can't speak on anybody else's side, where now you have preachers and people speaking of these churches actually bringing up these topics of UFOs, cryptids, and paranormal things. You have people out there like L.A. Marzulli, and oh my goodness, I can't believe I forgot his Stephen Quayle and Pastor Billy Crone out of Las Vegas, where now they're bringing these topics into the church. They seem a little more accepting of it. Why did I go there? Well, because it seems like now we're just kind of like switch places. So what is it now about science that it seems kind of not open to different opinions?
Okay, you're hitting a really great topic now. There's been a switch. It was the religious people who went to the scientists, Galileo, to say, stop this, cut it out. Mm-hmm. Now it is the science people who are dogmatic, not necessarily toward the religious, but toward witnesses who make the mistake, if you will, of reporting things that do not officially exist. So I talk in the book about how at any given time in history there is a prevailing worldview, prevailing understanding that people take as real. There's a word for any particular worldview called a paradigm. We operate within a particular paradigm or understanding. It's a kind of a fancy word for worldview or filter. And so generally at a given time in history, a worldview holds up. It pretty much explains a lot of reality, gives scientists what they need to do the normal work of everyday scientists, wearing the white lab coats and working in labs and doing the normal work of science. But in any field, physics, biochemistry, genetics, there are these, what can happen is there's a gathering of what are called anomalies, things that don't fit the prevailing story. They're not quite accounted for by the prevailing account. So Thomas Kuhn, author, K-U-H-N, author of a really important book from 1962 called The Structure of Scientific Revolutions. I'd like to say some of these books that are really important for those who want to study the deep scientific pieces of this. He wrote about how any particular worldview will start to accumulate too many anomalies. There are things that the worldview can't explain. So what happens is the advocates of that worldview, the the older scientists dig in their heels. They're not open to the new material. But gradually, as Kuhn puts it in the book, he quotes one of the leading, I think, quantum physics theorists who said, frankly, science proceeds one funeral at a time. Those who don't change their worldview eventually die off. And then there come onto the scene a new generation of researchers, let's say with the UFO phenomenon. People now in their 30s or 40s or 50s entering into science maybe have seen these events. They don't automatically dismiss them. They know that science is an accumulative process, that new understandings emerge, that science is never about settled dogma. If it is, it ain't science anymore. Remember when the dispute about the lockdown and the medical problem
Yes.
related to that thing that we dare not even say its name at this point because too many podcasters get strikes against them by the thought police. You can tell I'm on the side of free speech and free thought. But in any case, that was a very good example when they talked about the settled science says. No, science isn't settled. If you're talking about settled science, it's not science anymore. Science is ongoing. Anyway, so the point is, yeah, there's a new paradigm emerging. A good example is the near-death phenomenon. As the resuscitation skills, as the medical science has advanced and there's greater ability to bring people back from the brink of death, well, guess what? More people are coming back with these stories. And they come back with stories like this. After they've been finished with surgery, they've come through surgery, the anesthesia wears off, the doctor comes in and says to the patient, looking down on the bed, well, Mr. Jones, I'm here to tell you what your prognosis is. And Mr. Jones says, thank you, doctor, but I already know my prognosis. About an hour ago or a little while ago, I overheard you talking about it in the other wing of the hospital with Dr. Smith. You were eating a tuna fish sandwich, which you spilled on your tie, that spot right there. And then the patient might say something like, oh, by the way, out on the roof outside in the gutter up on the roof, there's a tennis shoe. Looks like somebody, it's upside down with a shoestring hanging. I mean, very specific thing. And the doctor, of course, has to lift his jaw off the floor. He's astonished. What are you talking about? How do you know I talked to Dr. Smith? The patient has gone out of their body. They went to the realm of the very edge of death. They were told that it wasn't their time. We now know these phenomena happen. They go through a tunnel, they receive wisdom, and then they come back. And they come back into their body and say, well, I know what my prognosis is. So now more and more scientists are open to the near-death phenomena, not based on faith, but based on these kinds of very compelling reports.
But I can only assume that maybe these doctors are not putting it out there. They listen to the story, but they're not coming out in the public with this, are they?
Oh, yeah, many of them have. I mean, some of the best researchers, a guy named Bruce Grayson, Greyson, wrote a book called After. He was raised in a strict scientific family. He was not an atheist, I don't think, but no expectation there's an afterlife, anything like that. It's a one-shot thing. Live your life. He began to, he had one of these witnesses, and one of the patients told him exactly that story about the spot on his tie, which he was embarrassed about anyway. He wished he hadn't spilled mayo on his tie. But, and then he began to, because he was a good scientist, he began to ask his patients when they came back from life-threatening surgery, is there anything by any chance you experienced? He didn't feed them anything, didn't feed them details, but they said, well, yes, doctor, I had this amazing experience. So he was, Grayson and other good researchers did indeed say, well, it's not my job to rule things out of bounds simply because I don't believe them. Yes, this challenges my belief system, but it appears maybe psychic realms are real. Consciousness allows minds to communicate with other minds across the distance of bodies, maybe miles, one wing of the hospital to another. I don't know how it happens, they would say, but it seems to happen. I have no right to rule this out of bounds because it challenges my belief system. I didn't come into science to reinforce an ideology. So yeah, they've come up, some of the best researchers on the near-death experience started out as hardcore mechanistic materialists who gradually opened up. And by the way, there are more and more academics on the UFO topic. Professor Gary Nolan at Stanford, one of the greatest immunologists alive today, may very well receive the Nobel Prize for his good work in immunology and genetics. has come out, described his own experiences with the UFO phenomenon, and calling on science to say, look, we don't have to believe anything, but we need to be open. So he's been a big voice in encouraging other academics who tend to be pretty hesitant, shy, because they know they might not get their grant renewed. If you're in science, it doesn't help to be associated with a subject like UFOs. But more and more scientists are saying, look, I can do my day job in biology or chemistry or physics, and I can ask these questions on weekends. And there's a growing acceptance. Yes, that's entirely acceptable.
And that's amazing because it's one of those things. We're all skeptics to a certain point, but up until it shows up at your front door, whether you're a UFO witness or abductee, whether you see a Bigfoot or dog man, or you have paranormal experiences, until you are there experiencing these things, that's when things change in your life. It's very life changing. And why do I bring this up? Because, and it wouldn't be me if I didn't bring this up before we go. Very interesting thing I saw in the bio that I received, where during your time, you were contacted by somebody over the phone from New York, a philanthropist, Lawrence Rockefeller. Now, he asked you something because this is super huge, and this is the gem, what I found here. He asked you to help him lobby President Clinton to disclose facts about, the legendary Roswell incident. Super huge, my friend. Two questions about that. What came out of that request? And two, did you have to ask for a FOIA request for that, or was it denied? So many questions I have here, but I'll leave you with those two on that.
Good. I know we're limited on time, so I'll be brief on this. We could do the whole hour on this. Maybe you'll have me back. We'll delve into some of these cases someday.
I would love to, yes.
Go further. I'd be happy to, because I love to talk about these things. So anyway, he had read my first book, which I did not know. It was called Angels and Aliens. It's no longer in print. But in that book, I made a lot of comparisons between the UFO phenomenon and near-death phenomena, the reports of shamans, indigenous communities with their beliefs in spirits and so forth that materialize, all of it. So out of the blue, I get a call from Lawrence Rockefeller, a member of the legendary family. And I knew of his interest in the UFO phenomenon. And he said, I'm reading your book. You're a big picture guy. And he was referring to the fact that I'm drawing a lot of those kind of parallels. I said, well, if that's what you mean, sir, I am. He said, well, I have something more pragmatic to ask you. Because of your interest and because of the credibility you bring to this, or help bring to it, which I appreciated, that's how he saw me. He said, I'm gathering together at my ranch in Wyoming in 2 months or something along those lines, a group of UFO researchers to try to prevail upon President Clinton to be more forthcoming, to be more transparent, to help release some of the information about the UFO phenomenon, because there was evidence Clinton was interested. He was still new to the office, only 2 years in, and he had expressed some interest. He said, I'm going to try to get to the bottom of this. So Rockefeller saw that. So long story short, we brainstormed at his ranch in Wyoming, a group of researchers, including the late John Mack of Harvard, Harvard psychiatrist who became very interested in the alien abduction phenomenon. And we decided we should limit the inquiry into Roswell instead of the UFO phenomenon as a whole. And so to keep it really simple, Rockefeller got close, this group got close to the president's science advisor, Jack Gibbons. Gibbons admitted, he said, I'm astonished by the evidence you're presenting to me. I had no idea. I'm happy to play an active role in helping you get further. So Gibbons made an inquiry into the Pentagon, or into the bowels of the federal bureaucracy, and they came back after a certain number of days or weeks by saying, this is to inform you that you will be disappointed to hear that we have found nothing that questions the government's report, that it was simply a meteorological device that crashed. Rockefeller and his team didn't really believe that. They knew that something had crashed that led to a lot of debris. And of course, the argument a strong argument can be made that it was an alien craft with aliens aboard. Could also have been some kind of top secret Russian craft. There's a case to be made for that, believe it or not. Or maybe even a top secret American experimental craft. But in any case, whatever crashed does not seem to have been only a weather balloon. But Rockefeller took it in stride. He was a pro. He thanked them for this and for their efforts, and politely and diplomatically, but said, "I'll be back. I'm going to continue my citizens' inquiry into this." So it was a great opportunity to work with, and a good example to show how a leading public citizen who didn't have much to gain, and I'm sure, in fact, I know for a fact that Lawrence Rockefeller, of all the Rockefeller family, was considered a little bit of the black sheep because he was interested in these kinds of philanthropic investigations of new philosophical ventures, new spiritual ventures. He was actually a very big mind. And yes, he'd done well. He was born well. He was very wealthy, but he put his money to work on a lot of good projects. So it was a pleasure and honor to work with him on that.
No, that's awesome. And I guess in a way, he's doing it in a big way. He's going try to lobby President Clinton, where folks on my side were bringing in the guests, we're reading the articles, and sometimes write the blogs, because we're all trying to come up with a conclusion, which is what's going on, what can we find out, and what can we exclude. But because we're all living in this human experience, but this human experience is not evolve on its own, and that's a whole different show for another day. So, my friend, for the listeners of Let's Find Out that would like to know more about you and get a copy of your book, and I also understand, I think we had a pre-interview, there's also going to be an audio book version of this as well. Where can they find out more about this?
Well, I have a website, and it is thompsonatlarge.com, Thompson with a P, THOMPSON, at large, spelled out.com. The links to Amazon, Barnes & Noble's, bookstore.org, and all of them are there. The book is available in print at the books, online or at a bookstore, an ebook online, or the audiobook through Audible and other Spotify. So it's out in multiple formats. And I'm also on Twitter, or now called X, at Keith Thompson 1, number 1. So that's how people can find me. They can find my work and the book. And I appreciate the opportunity to let people know how to reach me.
Excellent. I'm definitely following you on your socials as well. And my friend, I would love to invite you back on the show later this year, because we just scratched the surface on what we could talk about. I said we could talk about for hours, but I have some follow-up things. And I think,
well, by the way, that's interesting because, as you know, in a few weeks, the long-awaited book by Luis Elizondo, who headed up the Pentagon task force exploring this non-existent phenomenon, right? Well, he was secretly, he's coming out with his own book now about what he's found and what he's concluded. I don't know. The book is called Imminent, and I'm happy to push that book. I want to see him come out and see what he says. We're all going to learn a lot, but I think that book may up-level the whole discussion, because he's likely to make it right onto the bestseller list, because he headed the Pentagon secret group to explore this officially non-existent phenomenon, which the government knows is real. By the way, in that regard, I think most what the government doesn't want to talk about is that this phenomenon outclasses our technology, whatever its source is, other galaxies or other dimensions. The government doesn't understand, can't explain this, and the government can't very easily, in my view, cannot easily come out and say there's something in our skies we can't explain. We don't think it's dangerous. We don't think it's a threat, but we don't know. We'll keep you posted. No, they're not going to say that. So they've explained it away, but now the jig is up. Elizondo is ready to come out, and he's going to say, look, we have headed up a group to study this. So yeah, I would look forward to coming back, especially after Elizondo's book is out and there are new issues on the table. That'll be fascinating.
Absolutely. We're going to find out next time you come back on. I appreciate you being on the show today.
Thank you very much. It's been great to talk with you. Happy to know you.
Thank you, my friend. This has been another excellent episode of Let's Find Out with Diego. Please check us out on all our social media pages, as well as on YouTube, and we're also on Rumble. Like, share, and subscribe. Also, Let's Find Out is now on KGRA Digital Broadcasting. Catch the show on Saturdays at 2 a.m. For more information, please visit KGRADB.com. That's KGRADB.com. Thank you for taking this journey with me. Until next time, my friends.
Let's find out with Diego. The power of Diego madness. Ooh, yeah.
All content for Let's Find Out is property of co-host Diego and is served directly from our servers with no modification, redirects, or rehosting. All celebrity impersonators are paid performers. The impersonated celebrities do not endorse or promote any views or opinions expressed by our guests, co-host Diego, or Let's Find Out. The information shared on Let's Find Out is provided on an as-is basis, with no guarantees of completeness, accuracy, usefulness, or timeliness.